Welcome to Deep Thinkers. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere very old and very quiet. A dry riverbed in southern India, in a place called the Jureru River Valley, in the state of Andhra Pradesh. There is no water there now, or very little, only the memory of water in the shape of the land, the way the ground dips and curves where a river used to run. The sun has long since baked the earth pale, and if you were to kneel down in that valley and look at the wall of sediment that the archaeologists have carefully cut away, layer by patient layer, you would see something that has quietly unsettled one of the most famous stories science ever told about us. You would see running through the earth like a pale ribbon, a band of volcanic ash, fine, gritty, the color of old bone. It came from very far away, and it settled here a very long time ago, and it has waited in the dark ever since. And just below that band of ash pressed into the older ground, the archaeologists found stone tools, tools that human hands made, sharp little flakes struck from cores, the debris of someone sitting and working stone into something useful, something that could cut and scrape and shape. And then just above that same band of ash, in the younger ground that settled afterward, they found stone tools again, the same kind of tools, made the same way, by people working in the same tradition with the same patient knowledge in their hands. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is the whole of tonight's story compressed into a single image. Below the ash, people. Above the ash, people. And the tool-making, the careful, inherited craft of turning rock into edge, runs straight across that ash layer, almost as if nothing had happened at all. As if the people who knapped those stones the week before the ash fell were still there, or their children were, or their neighbors were, knapping the very same stones the week after. This matters because of what that ash is, that pale ribbon in the Indian riverbank, is not local. It did not come from some small hill nearby. It traveled thousands of kilometers through the sky to reach that valley. It is the fingerprint of one of the most violent things this planet has done in the last 2 million years. It is the ash of a supereruption. The eruption of a volcano so enormous that its name has, for a generation now, been spoken alongside one of the most dramatic claims in the entire story of our species. The claim that this eruption very nearly ended us. The eruption was at a place called Lake Toba on the island of Sumatra in Indonesia. It happened around 74,000 years ago, and the story that grew up around it goes something like this. The volcano erupted, the sky went dark, the world grew cold, and the whole of humanity, every human being alive on the earth, was squeezed down to a tiny, desperate remnant, a few thousand survivors. Some versions say as few as 1,000 breeding pairs. Our entire species, the whole future of everyone who would ever live, balanced on the edge of nothing, shivering through a long darkness, almost snuffed out. It is a powerful story. It is the kind of story that lodges in the mind and refuses to leave. You have probably heard some version of it. A volcano nearly wiped us out. We all descend from a handful of survivors. That is why human beings, all 8 billion of us, are so strangely, remarkably alike in our genes. We went through a bottleneck, the story says, a narrow neck of glass through which only a few grains of sand could pass. And on the far side of that neck, we were so few that we have carried the mark of that smallness in our blood ever since. And the tools in the Jureru River Valley, sitting calmly just above the ash, do not seem to know about any of this. They simply carry on. So here is the question I want to walk with you into tonight, slowly. The way you walk into deep water, a step at a time until the floor falls away beneath you, and you are floating. What if it never happened? What if the great near-extinction, the bottleneck that nearly ended us, the catastrophe that everyone repeats, as though it were as solid as the date on a coin, was never actually a thing that happened to real people in a real place? What if it was something far stranger? A guess that grew up over 20 years into a fact. A model that quietly put on the costume of a memory. Before we go down into it, let me ask you something the way I always like to. Wherever you are tonight, in whatever country, in whatever bed, in whatever quiet corner of the world the dark has found you in, I would like to know where that is. Leave it in the comments if you feel like it, before sleep takes you. Just the name of the place you are listening from. It is a small thing, but it makes this vast and very old subject feel a little less lonely to imagine all of us scattered across the turning earth, listening to the same slow story in the dark. And if you are new here, if you have only just found this quiet place, you might press the little button to follow along. There is no rush, there is no urgency to any of this. That is rather the point, because tonight we are not going to race anywhere. We are going to go down into one mystery slowly, and we are going to stay inside it. We are going to lay out the famous story and the evidence that has been quietly eating away at it, piece by piece, study by study for the last 15 years or so. And I will tell you now gently, so you are not left hanging in the dark, that there is no neat ending waiting for us. This is not a story where the mystery is solved and the lights come up and everyone goes home satisfied. This is a story about an argument that is still going on right now among living scientists in the present tense. The catastrophe version has been weakened, but it has not been killed. The evidence against it is real, but it is not final, and I think that unsettled, open quality is the most beautiful part of it. We are going to sink into a question that nobody has the bottom of. So let yourself sink with it. There is nothing you need to decide now. Let me ground you first in the thing that is not in doubt, because before we start pulling threads loose, I want you to feel just how real the volcano itself was. The eruption happened. Of that there is no argument at all. The only argument is about what it did to us. Lake Toba today is a calm and beautiful place. It is a great body of water in the highlands of northern Sumatra, ringed by green hills, with an island sitting in the middle of it that is nearly the size of a small country in its own right. People go there. It is a tourist spot, a place to look out over still water and breathe mountain air. And almost none of them, standing at the viewpoints, looking out over that serene blue lake, are thinking about what they are actually looking at. Because that lake is not really a lake in the ordinary sense. It is a wound, it is a caldera, it is the hole left behind when a vast chamber of molten rock beneath the ground emptied itself into the sky in a matter of days, and the roof of the emptied chamber collapsed inward, leaving a sunken basin that slowly filled with water over the long ages afterward. The deadliest place on Earth, 74,000 years ago, is now a postcard. And that caldera is enormous. It is roughly 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. It is the largest such crater anywhere on Earth from the whole of the last couple of million years. When you stand at one end of that lake, the far shore is over the horizon. That is the size of the hole the eruption left behind. That is the footprint of the thing. Geologists rate eruptions on a scale called the Volcanic Explosivity Index. You can think of it the way you think of the scale for earthquakes, where each step up is not a little more but a great deal more, where the difference between one number and the next is a leap rather than a step. The scale runs up to 8. 8 is the top. 8 is the ceiling, the very largest category there is. And we have a special word for the eruptions that reach it. We call them supereruptions. Toba is one of them. A magnitude 8, the very top of the scale. To give that a shape your mind can hold on to, let me give you a number. and then let me make the number mean something, because a number on its own is just a sound. The Toba eruption threw out on the order of 2,800 cubic kilometers of material. Now, a cubic kilometer is already a thing the mind struggles with. Picture a block of solid rock 1 kilometer wide, 1 kilometer long, and 1 kilometer tall. A single one of those is already more than you can really imagine, a mountain's worth of stone. Now picture nearly 3,000 of them hurled out of the ground and into the air. That is what Toba did. If that still feels like an abstraction, here is a comparison that might help it land. There was an eruption in the United States in 1980, Mount St. Helens, that many people remember, that was caught on film, that flattened forests and made headlines around the world. It was a genuinely large and deadly eruption. Toba was on the order of thousands of times bigger than that. Not twice as big, not 10 times, thousands of times. And here is another one, closer to our story, that we will come back to later. In 1815, a volcano in Indonesia called Tambora erupted, and that eruption was so large that it cooled the entire planet for a year and caused famines on the far side of the world. Toba was roughly 100 times bigger than even that, so this was not an ordinary disaster. This was very nearly the largest thing a volcano can be, and when it erupted, it did not keep its ash to itself. The ash from Toba has a name. Scientists call it the Youngest Toba Tuff, which is simply the technical name for the layer of compacted ash from the most recent of Toba's great eruptions. You can shorten it to its initials if you like, the YTT, but the long version tells you what it is, the youngest, the most recent. The tuff, which is just the word for rock, made of compacted volcanic ash. The Toba, which tells you where it came from. And this layer of ash is one of the most useful things in the whole of this science because it went everywhere. When Toba erupted, it flung a colossal cloud of fine ash into the upper atmosphere, and the winds caught that cloud and carried it across the world. And then, over the following weeks and months, that ash came down. It came down across the Indian subcontinent, that whole great wedge of land, settling into river valleys and lake beds, and that is why it is sitting there, in the Jureru River Valley wall where our story began. In places across central India, that ash bed is thick, reaching up to around 3 meters in some spots, a layer you could stand inside, taller than a person. It came down into the Bay of Bengal, that great arm of the Indian Ocean, and settled onto the sea floor. It came down into the South China Sea, it came down into the Arabian Sea, and it traveled, astonishingly, all the way to East Africa, where it has been found in the sediments at the bottom of a great lake called Lake Malawi, thousands of kilometers from Sumatra, on another continent entirely. Now I want you to understand why scientists love this so much, because it is genuinely lovely, and it matters for everything that comes after. When a single layer of ash is laid down across half the world in the same brief moment, it becomes a kind of stopwatch frozen into the ground, a marker horizon they call it. Imagine you had 100 old books, and someone, in one single afternoon, walked through every library in the world and pressed the same pale thumbprint onto one page of each of them. After that, no matter how jumbled the books became, no matter how their pages were shuffled by time, you could open any 2 of them, find the pale thumbprint, and know with certainty that those 2 pages were written in the same moment. That is what the Toba ash does. A geologist can pull a core of sediment from the bottom of the Bay of Bengal, and another from a riverbank in India, and another from the floor of Lake Malawi in Africa, and find in each of them that same pale band of Toba ash, and instantly know that whatever is just below the ash in one core happened at the same time as whatever is just below the ash in the others. It synchronizes the world. It lets them line up the deep past across continents. And that, you see, is what makes the rest of this story possible to even ask. Because if you have a single moment frozen into the ground across the whole world, then you can go to any of those places and you can look at what is sitting just below the ash and just above it. And you can ask the most natural question in the world: what changed? What was the world like the week before this great ash fell, and what was it like the week after? Did everything collapse? Did the populations of living things crash and the forests die and the lakes fall quiet? And in the Jereru River Valley in southern India, the answer that came back was the one we started with, and it was not the answer the famous story had led everyone to expect. Below the ash, people making tools. Above the ash, people making the same tools. The stopwatch caught the moment of supposed apocalypse, and on both sides of it, life simply carried on. The work that found those tools was led by an archaeologist named Michael Petraglia, and it was published in the year 2007 in the journal Science, which is one of the most serious and scrutinized places a scientist can put their findings. This was not a rumor or a wild claim on the internet. This was careful, peer-reviewed excavation, layer by layer, with the tools mapped and the ash identified by its chemistry as genuinely belonging to Toba. And what Petraglia and his team described was a tool-making tradition that was essentially continuous across the ash. The way the tools were made before the eruption, the particular techniques, the particular forms, carried straight on into the layers above. There was no break, no sudden silence in the record, no long empty stretch where the people vanished and the land lay abandoned, which is exactly what you would expect to see if the eruption had killed everyone in the region. Instead, there was continuity, persistence, people doing the same thing on both sides of the most violent volcanic event in 2 million years. This is, I think, the single most picturable challenge to the great catastrophe story. You do not need to understand genetics or climate modeling to feel the weight of it. You only need to imagine those two sets of tools, the ones below and the ones above, lying quietly in the earth a few centimeters apart with the ash between them, made by hands working the same craft, as though the sky going dark for a time was simply something that happened and was endured, and not the end of the world at all. And so we arrive at the strange shape of tonight's mystery, and I want to lay it out plainly before we go deeper, so you can carry it with you down into sleep. On one side, there is the famous claim, the bottleneck, the near-extinction, the few thousand survivors, the 1,000 breeding pairs, the whole species nearly snuffed out by a darkening sky. And on the other side, there is the riverbank in India, where people did not stop, and, as we will see in the parts to come, an African lake that recorded no catastrophe in its mud, and a stretch of South African coast where people seem to have thrived right through the supposed disaster, and a tangle of genetic studies that no longer point cleanly at the volcano at all. So how do we hold these two things together? How can the famous story be so confident, so widely repeated, so settled in the popular mind, while the actual ground, the actual stone tools and lake sediments and genetic data keeps refusing to cooperate? The answer, and this is the heart of the whole thing, the reframe that I want you to fall asleep holding, is this. The near extinction was never something anybody saw. It was never a count of bodies. Nobody ever dug up a layer of the earth and found the bones of the last few thousand humans huddled together. The number, the few thousand survivors, the 1,000 breeding pairs, was not a measurement of the past. It was an output of a model. It was a calculation. It was a conclusion that came out of a particular way of reading the genetics of living people, run through a particular set of assumptions, and then matched up, after the fact, with the date of a volcano that happened to be sitting in roughly the right place in time. Let me say that again slowly, because it is the thing that changes everything, and it is the kind of distinction that is easy to miss, and that once you see it, you cannot unsee. There is a difference between observing something and inferring it. If I dig up an ancient hearth and find the charred bones of the animals someone cooked there, I have observed something. I am looking at the actual remains of the actual event. But if I look at the genes of people alive today and notice that they are all very similar to one another, and from that similarity I calculate backward and conclude that at some point in the past the population must have been small, I have not observed anything in the past at all. I have inferred it. I have built a model, fed it the data I can see in the present, and let it tell me a story about a present I cannot see. And the story the model tells depends entirely on the assumptions I built into it. Change the assumptions and the story changes. The near-extinction was always a story of that second kind. It was an inference, a reconstruction, a model. And there is nothing wrong with that. Inference is most of what science does about the deep past, because the deep past does not leave us many bodies to count. But there is a very great difference between a careful inference, held lightly, hedged with maybes, and a number that has hardened into a fact that everyone repeats, as though someone had been there with a clipboard and counted the survivors one by one. And that hardening, that quiet slide from a tentative guess into a confident textbook fact, is itself one of the most interesting things about this whole story. We are going to watch it happen in the parts to come. We are going to watch a careful hypothesis put on, over the course of 20 years, the heavy and unearned costume of certainty. But notice the loop this opens, the question that the model was built to answer in the first place, because we cannot simply throw the bottleneck away without dealing with it. The reason the near-extinction story was so appealing, the reason it caught on and would not let go, is that it answered a real and genuine puzzle. And the puzzle is this: human beings really are strangely similar to one another. This part is not in dispute at all. If you take any two human beings from anywhere on the planet, two strangers from opposite sides of the Earth, and you compare their genetic code, you will find them remarkably alike. More alike than you might expect. So alike that it surprises the people who study it. To feel how unusual that is, you have to compare us to our nearest living relatives. Consider chimpanzees. You might think that two chimpanzees living in the very same forest, members of the same troop, neighbors who see each other every day, would be more or less genetically identical, far more similar to each other than two humans from opposite ends of the world. But the opposite is true. Two chimpanzees from a single forest can carry more genetic difference between them than two humans separated by an entire planet. We, the species that has spread to every continent and filled every corner of the Earth, are the genetically uniform ones. The chimpanzees tucked into their forests are the diverse ones. That is the real puzzle. That is the genuine, undisputed observation sitting underneath this whole story. Human genetic diversity is low. We are all very much alike. And something must explain that. The near-extinction story was one explanation, and it was an elegant one. If the whole species really did pass through a narrow neck, if we really were reduced to a few thousand individuals at some point, then of course we would be similar today. We would all be the descendants of that small remnant, all carrying variations on the same small set of genes that those few survivors happen to have. A bottleneck would erase diversity the way a fire erases a forest, leaving only the few seeds that survive to regrow everything that came after. It is a beautiful, tidy explanation. Low diversity because we nearly died. And a volcano sitting right there in the timeline, ready to be the cause. But here is where I want to leave you tonight, on the edge of the deeper water, with the loop open and unclosed, the way these old mysteries like to leave you. Because low diversity is real and it does need explaining, but a bottleneck is not the only thing that can produce it. And the date of that bottleneck, when scientists have gone back and looked at it more carefully, with better tools and more data, has a way of refusing to sit still on the volcano. The number that everyone repeats was an inference, and an inference is only ever as solid as the assumptions beneath it. Pull the assumptions, and the number drifts. So if humanity did not crash to a few thousand survivors, if the tools in the Indian riverbank kept right on being made, and the people simply did not stop, then we are left holding the original puzzle with the famous answer taken away. Why are we so similar? Why do we alone among the great apes carry so little difference between us? If it was not the volcano, if it was not the great darkening and the long cold and the near end of everything, then what was it? That is the thread we are going to follow down into the dark. We are going to go back to the beginning, to the two studies, 15 years apart, that stitched this story together in the first place. We are going to meet the scientist who noticed the low diversity in our genes and the scientist who tied that genetic scar to the volcano and gave the world its catastrophe. We are going to learn how a guess became a textbook fact. And then, one at a time, we are going to watch the props pulled out from under it, but not yet. For now, just hold the image. The pale band of ash in the riverbank, the tools below it and the tools above it, made by the same patient hands, and the long, quiet question hanging over all of it, still unanswered, still argued over by living people right now, in laboratories and lecture halls in the present tense. Let the deep thoughts settle, and let yourself sink with them. The year was 1993, not a dramatic year, as years in the history of science go. No paradigm-shattering announcement, no press conference under bright lights, no headline that rearranged the way ordinary people thought about themselves. Just a paper. A careful, technical paper published in a scientific journal, written by Henry Harpending and a group of colleagues about something that had been quietly bothering geneticists for a while. Something in the blood, something in the inherited machinery of the cell that did not quite add up. What Harpending and his colleagues were studying was mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondria are the small, ancient, semi-independent structures inside almost every cell in your body, and they carry their own scrap of genetic code separate from the long instructions wound inside the nucleus. Think of them as tiny power stations that arrived billions of years ago as a kind of merger, a bacterium that moved inside another cell and never left, and is now so thoroughly domesticated that it cannot exist outside it. That mitochondrial DNA passes from mothers to their children, not mixed and reshuffled the way the rest of your genome is, but handed down almost intact, like a document that gets slowly marked up by copying errors over time. Those copying errors, mutations, accumulate slowly and steadily enough that geneticists can use them as a kind of clock. Count the differences between two people's mitochondrial sequences, and you can estimate, roughly, how long ago they shared a common ancestor through their maternal line. And when Harpending and his colleagues did that counting across a broad sample of humans from different parts of the world, what they found was that the differences were startlingly small. People from opposite sides of the planet, from populations that had been separated for tens of thousands of years, were genetically more similar to one another than you might expect from a species as widespread and varied as ours. The mitochondrial clock said we were all surprisingly close, suspiciously close, in the way that two strangers who share a great-grandmother without knowing it might look more alike than either of them can explain. This was not a new observation in 1993. Earlier studies had circled the same strangeness. But Harpending's work helped sharpen it into a specific and somewhat unsettling picture. At some point in the fairly recent past, in evolutionary terms, the human population had passed through what geneticists call a bottleneck, a narrow passage, a moment when the number of reproducing individuals had fallen far enough and stayed low long enough for much of the variation in the gene pool to simply be lost. the way a small group of people taking passage on a boat to a new continent carry only a fraction of the diversity of the country they left behind. The passengers are real and their descendants are real, but all the people who did not board that boat took their genetic variations with them into whatever future they had, and those variations did not cross the water. The observation of low diversity was not disputed then, and it is not disputed now. It is, in a sense, one of the most robustly established facts in human genetics. Any two humans picked at random from any two places on the planet will be more genetically similar to each other than two chimpanzees picked at random from the same small stretch of forest in Central Africa. We are, as a species, remarkably uniform beneath the superficial variations of skin tone and eye shape, and the features that make us recognizable as members of different populations. The genome of every person alive today could fit, in terms of its actual variation, within the range that a single population of chimpanzees carries as a matter of course. That is the real strangeness. That is the thing that needed an explanation. What Harpending's work did not do, what it could not do with the tools available in 1993, was tell you precisely when the bottleneck happened, or exactly how small the population had become, or what had caused it. Those questions were left open, waiting for a better answer. And the answer, when it came, arrived from a completely different field, from someone who was not a geneticist, but an anthropologist, and who was thinking not about blood, but about ash. Stanley Ambrose was at the University of Illinois. He had been following both lines of evidence, the genetic signal and the geological record of the Toba eruption, and in 1998 he published a paper that brought them together in a way that felt, at the time, almost too tidy to be coincidence. The genetic scar pointed to a bottleneck somewhere in the relatively recent past. The Toba eruption, which left its ash across the entire Indian Ocean basin and beyond, had occurred roughly 74,000 years ago, and Ambrose's argument was that those two signals were pointing at the same event. The volcanic eruption had triggered a volcanic winter, a sustained cooling of the planet caused by the sulfur dioxide the eruption had thrown into the stratosphere, that had devastated the human population, reducing it to the few thousand survivors whose descendants we all are today. The 6-year volcanic winter was the mechanism at the center of his model. 6 years of cold, and then a longer tail of reduced sunlight and disrupted growing seasons. Ambrose suggested a 1,000-year cold snap, a prolonged period of misery in which the world's ecosystems were struggling to recover, and the thin, scattered populations of early humans were struggling with them. The number that came out of the model, roughly 3,000 to 10,000 surviving individuals, sometimes cited more dramatically as few as 1,000 breeding pairs, was the minimum population consistent with the genetic diversity we see today. It was not a count, there was no census, there was no head count of survivors, no list of names. It was a backwards calculation. If this much diversity is missing from the genome, and if a bottleneck is the reason, and if Toba is the cause of the bottleneck, then the population must have fallen to at least this low for at least this long. You can see the architecture of the argument. It rests on 3 pillars: the genetic observation, real, measured, undisputed; the volcanic event, also real, enormous, documented in ash beds across half the planet; and the mechanism, a volcanic winter, severe enough and long enough to crush a species already sparse and widely scattered across tropical and subtropical landscapes that would have been particularly vulnerable to a sustained cold snap. Each pillar supported the others. The genetics needed an event. The event needed a mechanism. The mechanism produced numbers that matched the genetics, the story locked together. And when a story locks together that cleanly, when the pieces fit that well, it is very easy to stop asking whether the pieces are actually the right pieces or whether they are just pieces of roughly the right shape that happen to fit in the gap you were trying to fill. Now, the mechanism itself, Because if you are going to understand why the volcanic winter argument was so persuasive, you need to understand what a volcanic winter actually is, and why a supereruption like Toba could plausibly cause one. When a very large volcano erupts, it throws enormous amounts of material into the atmosphere: rock, ash, gas. The ash, the heavy particulate matter, falls back down relatively quickly. Days, weeks, months. But the sulfur dioxide is different. Sulfur dioxide injected into the stratosphere, the layer of atmosphere above where weather happens, above the clouds and the rain and the churning lower atmosphere, reacts with water vapor to form tiny droplets of sulfuric acid, sulfate aerosols. These are extraordinarily fine, small enough to stay aloft for years, and they spread, carried by stratospheric winds, across the entire globe. And once they are up there, they do something very simple and very consequential. They reflect sunlight. Not all of it, but a significant fraction. Sunlight that would have reached the ground and warmed it instead bounces back into space, and the surface below cools. This is not theoretical. We have watched it happen. In 1991, Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted. A large eruption by ordinary standards, though nowhere near a supereruption. It was rated VEI 6 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, 2 orders of magnitude smaller than Toba's VEI 8, and it cooled the global average surface temperature by roughly half a degree Celsius for a year or two. Half a degree sounds modest, but it was measurable on weather stations around the world. Scientists tracked it. They watched the temperature anomaly spread and then slowly fade as the aerosols settled out of the stratosphere. That is the living proof of the mechanism. A volcano significantly smaller than Toba shifted global temperatures. Scale it up to a VEI 8 to roughly 2,800 cubic kilometers of erupted material, 100 times the volume of Mount Tambora in 1815 and thousands of times the volume of Mount St. Helens in 1980, and the potential for atmospheric disruption becomes very large very quickly. The sulfur dioxide output alone would have been staggering. The stratospheric aerosol blanket would have been dense and global. The cooling would have been immediate. And on the basis of the mechanism, a multi-year reduction in sunlight and surface temperature is entirely plausible. But the word plausible is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and plausible is not the same as confirmed. The Tambora eruption in 1815 is the closest real-world test case we have, and it is instructive in both directions. Tambora, also in Indonesia, is the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. It was rated VEI 7, 1 step below Toba on a logarithmic scale, which means roughly 10 times smaller. And what it caused the following year, 1816, has been remembered ever since as the year without a summer. In New England, there was snow in June. In parts of Europe, crops failed 2 years running. Famine touched communities from the upland valleys of Switzerland to the rice paddies of Asia. The disruption was real. It was documented in diaries and harvest records and price data, and it was miserable. Tambora in 1815 is what makes the Toba argument feel not just plausible, but almost inevitable. If a VEI 7 disrupted agriculture across the northern hemisphere and caused a year of abnormal cold and crop failure, then a VEI 8 10 times larger or more might genuinely have caused something much worse, something lasting years rather than months. But here is the thing you have to hold alongside that logic. The year without a summer killed people, and it caused genuine suffering, but it did not come close to ending the human species. It did not even come close to significantly reducing the human population. By 1816, the global population was approaching 1 billion people, spread across every continent except Antarctica, with diverse food sources, stored grains, trade networks, and the accumulated agricultural and technological capacity of 10,000 years of civilization. They suffered, they adapted, they survived. The species barely noticed at the scale of the whole. 74,000 years ago, the calculation was different. The human population was much smaller, much more dispersed, living in small groups across a landscape that was already near the edge of what it could support in terms of hunted game and gathered plants. There were no granaries, no trade networks capable of moving food across continents. If the growing seasons in Central Africa shortened significantly for several consecutive years, there was no alternative supply chain. If the herds moved or thinned, the hunters moved with them or went hungry. The logic of vulnerability was real. Ambrose's argument had that much going for it. Even a modest volcanic winter falling on a sparse and technologically limited population could in principle cause genuine serious population collapse. That reasoning was not foolish. It was not sloppy. It was a considered synthesis of two real observations connected by a mechanism that we can observe in smaller form in the historical record. And it produced a story so clean, so satisfying in its structure, that it moved from hypothesis to widely repeated claim with a speed that is itself worth noticing. By the early 2000s, the Toba catastrophe theory had become a staple of popular science writing. The number, a few thousand survivors, maybe just 1,000 breeding pairs, was stated in books and documentaries and magazine articles not as a model output, but as a finding, not as a hypothesis, but as a fact. The ash layer in the Indian subcontinent, sometimes reaching 3 meters deep in central India, became the visual proof of the catastrophe. Of course, something that produced that much ash must have nearly ended us. Of course it did. And there was something else at work in the spread of this story, something that goes beyond the quality of the science and into the mechanics of how ideas move through a culture. The Toba hypothesis told a gripping and flattering story about us. It told us that humanity had stood at the edge of the abyss, that every person alive today is descended from the survivors of an almost extinction, that the genes we carry are the inheritance of a handful of people who somehow endured a catastrophe that killed almost everyone else. It turned all of us into descendants of survivors. It gave our species a near-death story, the kind of story that creates meaning and resonance and a particular kind of wonder at our own improbability. That is not a criticism of the people who told the story or the people who accepted it. Humans are drawn to narratives of survival. We are drawn to origin stories that make us feel significant or fragile or both at once. The Toba hypothesis was doing what a good story does. It was connecting two real things, our strangely uniform genes and an ancient geological catastrophe, and explaining both with a single, dramatic, and emotionally resonant cause. We survived, against all probability. Because of that, you exist. The problem is that stories which feel that satisfying have a way of becoming facts before the evidence is fully in. And what made the Toba hypothesis look like a fact for roughly 2 decades was the ash itself. The Youngest Toba Tuff, the name geologists give to the ash layer from the main eruption event, is one of the most useful synchronization tools in the physical record of the last 100,000 years. It is everywhere. It is in the sediment cores drilled from the bottom of the Bay of Bengal. It is in cores from the Arabian Sea. It is in the deep lake muds of Lake Malawi in East Africa. It has been found as far east as the South China Sea. In the Indian subcontinent, you can see it with your eyes, a pale band in the walls of river valley sections, sometimes reaching several meters in thickness in the areas closest to the eruption. This is the ash of a single event, spread by wind and ocean across a vast portion of the Earth's surface, and because it falls simultaneously everywhere it lands, it functions as a global time stamp, a geological signal that lets scientists at 2 sites thousands of kilometers apart know they are looking at the same moment in time. That is an extraordinary scientific tool. It means that if you are excavating a site in India and you find the Toba ash layer, you know precisely when you are. Everything below the ash is older than roughly 74,000 years. Everything above it is younger. You have a fixed point, a geological date marked in the rock itself that no amount of radiocarbon uncertainty or argon error can displace within any meaningful margin. The ash is the clock, and this clock, for a long time, seemed to be confirming Ambrose's story. Archaeologists working across the Indian subcontinent in the years after his 1998 paper looked at the record around the ash layer, and what they generally saw, or believed they saw, was a gap, stone tool assemblages below the ash, and then a pause, an absence, and then tools resuming much later, as if the populations that had been there before the eruption had simply vanished and been replaced, eventually, by people who had moved in from somewhere else after the worst had passed. The ash was the boundary. Below it was one world. Above it was a different world. This archaeological gap became the third pillar of the Toba catastrophe hypothesis. The genetics said a bottleneck. The eruption provided the mechanism. And now the archaeology, at least as it was being read at the time, seemed to confirm a real physical disappearance of people from the landscape. The evidence seemed to be in triplicate. It is very hard to challenge a three-legged structure. Pull one leg and the other two seem to hold it up. The genetics is real. Something caused the low diversity. The eruption was real. Something that size must have caused a winter. The gap is real. The archaeology shows a discontinuity. What else could it be? What other explanation could possibly account for all three at once? That is the question that was waiting patiently for the right set of tools, the right excavation, the right sediment core. And slowly, beginning in the mid-2000s, the answers started arriving from places that were not in the script. The ash layer, it turned out, was not only a clock, it was also a test. A test you could run at site after site across the Indian Ocean, Basin and East Africa, a natural experiment that had been running for 74,000 years and waiting for someone to read its results carefully enough, because the Toba ash did not just tell you when you were, it also told you if you looked at everything happening on either side of it at the same moment, whether the catastrophe had actually arrived, whether the world above the ash was truly different from the world below it, whether the populations that had been living in those landscapes had been disrupted or diminished or erased, or whether in some places they had simply kept going. And in that dry riverbank in the Jureru River Valley in Andhra Pradesh in southern India, Michael Petraglia and his colleagues found stone tools on both sides of the ash, the same kinds of tools, made in the same kinds of ways, above and below. As if the people who had been there when the sky turned dark and the ash began to fall had continued being there when the sky cleared again, making the same patient choices about which rock to strike and how and toward what edge. That discovery did not immediately overturn the Toba hypothesis. Science does not work that way. One site, however careful the excavation, however clear the stratigraphy, is not enough to rewrite a three-legged story that had been building for a decade. But it was the first significant pull. It loosened something, and once a structure begins to loosen, you start to notice the places where it was always a little less solid than it looked. Petraglia published in 2007 in Science. And the argument that his Jwalapuram excavation provoked was not simply about whether people had survived in India, it was also about who those people were. The tools they left behind, a Middle Stone Age assemblage, sometimes also called Middle Paleolithic in the wider regional terminology, were tools associated with behaviorally modern humans, or at least with the populations moving out of Africa, who would eventually give rise to all living people outside that continent. If those tools were there before 74,000 years ago and continued being made after the eruption, then modern humans or their near ancestors, were already out of Africa, already in India, earlier than many models had assumed. That secondary argument, the question of who made the tools and what their presence implied for the timeline of human dispersal out of Africa, became its own contested territory. Some researchers accepted the interpretation that these were modern humans already established in southern Asia before the Toba event. Others were not convinced, arguing that the tools alone could not carry the weight of that identification, that similar tool types were made by other hominin populations, and that the identity of the tool makers remained genuinely uncertain. The debate about the tools folded into a larger, older debate about when and how many times the ancestors of living non-African populations left the continent of their origin. But notice what happened. A site that was meant to confirm the story of catastrophe, or by showing a gap, by showing the discontinuity that the model predicted, instead showed the opposite. And then the effort to explain away the opposite finding opened further questions about deeper assumptions the model had been quietly relying on. The threads, once pulled, did not stop. Ambrose had stitched two things together in 1998, a genetic reading and a geological event. The ash was the thread that connected them, the synchronizing agent, the reason you could say that the bottleneck in the genome and the bottleneck in the population happened at the same time and for the same reason. But the ash is global. The ash is the same ash whether you find it in India or in Africa or in the Bay of Bengal, and that means the test is global too. If the Toba eruption caused a volcanic winter severe enough to crash the human species to a few thousand survivors, the signal of that winter should be visible not only in the archaeological record, but in the physical record of the climate, in sediment cores, in pollen sequences, in the chemical traces left by the organisms that were living in lakes and bogs and river systems when the sky went dark. The ash was everywhere. The winter, if there had been one, severe enough to do what the hypothesis required, should have left its own fingerprint alongside it. And in some places, when scientists went looking for that fingerprint, they did not find it. That is where we are heading next. Into the cores pulled from a deep African lake and the quiet, careful absence of a catastrophe that should have been impossible to miss. But hold that question for a moment. Let it wait the way questions wait when you are drifting somewhere slow and warm, half inside a thought and half somewhere else entirely. The ash fell. The tools kept being made. And somewhere in the mud of a lake that was old before any human being walked beside it, the evidence was sitting in the dark, waiting to be read. What Ambrose had done in 1998 was something scientists do constantly and necessarily. He had built a model. A model is not a lie, and it is not an error. A model is a framework, a structured attempt to explain a set of observations by proposing a mechanism and then checking whether the outputs of that mechanism match what you can actually measure. Models are how science makes progress when direct observation is impossible. You cannot watch the human population of 74,000 years ago. You cannot count the survivors. You cannot run the eruption again with slightly different parameters and see how it comes out. So you build a model and you make it as rigorous as you can with the data you have, and you test its predictions against the available evidence, and you revise it when the evidence does not fit. The problem is not in the building of models. The problem is in what happens to models when they stop being models and start being facts. When the number, 3 to 10,000 survivors, 1,000 breeding pairs, stops being labeled as a model output and starts being stated without qualification in books and articles and documentary narrations. When the mechanism, the 6-year volcanic winter, stops being a proposed mechanism and becomes the assumed mechanism. When the three-legged structure becomes load-bearing in people's understanding of their own origin and the qualification that this is all inference, all backwards calculation, all a story assembled from pieces that fit together but were never directly observed. When that qualification disappears quietly into the background, and what is left is just, we almost went extinct. The volcano almost got us. That is what had happened by the time Petraglia's team crouched in a dry Indian riverbank in the early 2000s and began brushing ash from stone tools that should not have been there. The model had become the memory. And a memory, once it has settled into the way people talk about things, is much harder to dislodge than a model. A model invites revision. A memory feels like loss when you take it away. The Toba catastrophe theory was never, at any point in its history, a fabricated story. The people who built it were doing careful work with the best available tools. Ambrose's synthesis was a genuine contribution, a serious attempt to explain a genuine puzzle using real evidence. But the evidence, it turned out, was thinner than the story it was being asked to support. The genetic observation was solid, but the date of the bottleneck was imprecise, and the cause was inferred, not identified. The eruption was enormous, but the severity and duration of the volcanic winter it caused were model-dependent and contested from fairly early on. The archaeological gap was real at some sites, but not others, and interpreting a gap in the record as evidence of population collapse requires care about what causes gaps. Sedimentation changes, erosion, preservation biases. The simple fact that we have excavated a tiny fraction of the sites that existed. 3 pillars, each of them real, but each of them more uncertain than the story required, and 3 independent lines of inquiry, beginning in the mid-2000s and continuing through the 2010s and beyond, that each came for a different pillar. The tools in the Indian riverbank for the archaeological gap, a lake in East Africa for the volcanic winter, and more slowly, the genome itself, as new methods and new data quietly eroded the neat alignment between the genetic scar and the date of the eruption. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, the story is still in 1998. Ambrose's paper is in print. The hypothesis has a name. The name has a number, and the number, 3 to 10,000 or perhaps only 1,000 breeding pairs, has already begun its journey from model output to textbook fact. The ash from Toba is sitting in the sediment of lakes and the walls of river valleys across a quarter of the world's surface, waiting. The tools in Jwalapuram are buried under meters of accumulated sediment waiting. The cores from Lake Malawi have not yet been drilled. The glass shards from Toba at the coastal sites of South Africa have not yet been identified and analyzed. The evidence is all there. It is in the ground. It has been there for 74,000 years. Patient, as geology is always patient. It just needs to be found and found carefully and read without the prior commitment to the story that it is supposed to confirm. That is what science is supposed to do. Find the evidence, read it without prior commitment, and revise when the reading surprises you. It does not always happen quickly, and it does not always happen without argument, and it does not produce a clean final answer at a given moment when everyone agrees and the question is closed. It produces something messier than that, and more interesting and more honest. It produces what we have right now with the Toba hypothesis, a live dispute in the present tense with real stakes and real uncertainty, and researchers on both sides still working, still publishing, still disagreeing. And into that live dispute we are now going to bring the evidence. The evidence that the volcanic winter, if it happened at all as Ambrose imagined, left itself strangely hard to find in the places it should have been impossible to miss. Begin with Jwalapuram. Not as a place name to be noted and moved on from, but as a scene, something the mind can settle into and turn over slowly in the way that only matters when the claim you are examining is as large as the one we have been building toward. The Jureru River cuts through the Kurnool district of Andhra Pradesh in southern India, and along its banks the sediment has been accumulating for a very long time, layer on layer on layer, each one a season, a century, a slow geological chapter, deposited and forgotten until someone thought to dig. Michael Petraglia and his colleagues thought to dig. What they found when they published their work in 2007 in the journal Science was something that should have stopped the Toba catastrophe hypothesis in its tracks. It did not stop it, but it did something important to it, something quiet and structural, the way a hairline crack is quiet and structural before the weight above it becomes too much. Below the ash, there were tools. This is not by itself remarkable. People lived in India before the eruption. Of course, there were tools below the ash. The ash is a horizon, a moment in time, and everything below it is simply before that moment, which means human beings making stone tools in the Jureru River Valley before 74,000 years ago is not news and was not claimed to be. What was claimed, what the Toba catastrophe hypothesis required, explicitly or implicitly, was that above the ash there was nothing, or very nearly nothing, a gap, a silence in the record. The volcanic winter and the crash of population and the centuries of cold and starvation should have left the land empty, or nearly so, for long enough that the archaeology above the ash would be sparse, disrupted, different, reflecting the break. Above the ash there were also tools, the same kinds of tools, made in the same way, using the same knapping techniques, belonging to the same broad tradition of stone technology. The same human hand, or something very close to the same human hand, was working the stone on both sides of that grey layer, and it was working it in essentially the same way. There was no gap that the catastrophe hypothesis required to be there. There was continuity. Petraglia's team described this as a Middle Paleolithic or Middle Stone Age assemblage, and that categorization matters because Middle Stone Age technology in Africa is one of the signatures of behaviorally modern humans, the kind of stone working associated with people like us rather than with older or more archaic populations. If the tools at Jwalapuram represent the same tradition above and below the ash, and if that tradition belongs to modern humans, then modern humans were in India before 74,000 years ago, and they were still in India after it, and the catastrophe that was supposed to have emptied the landscape apparently did not empty this particular valley in Andhra Pradesh, or anywhere near it, in all directions from it, because the ash layer is continuous and recognizable for hundreds of kilometers across the Indian subcontinent, and the tools are in it in this place and only partly hidden by it in others. This is the single image that the whole argument pivots on, and it is worth letting it sit. Picture the physical reality of it. The ash comes down, and at the worst of it, in India, it comes down thick, meters of it in some places, a visible white and grey blanket that would have darkened the sky and settled over every surface. Then time passes. More sediment accumulates, river by river, season by season. And then archaeologists remove that accumulated time one careful layer at a time, and they find tools beneath the ash, and they keep going, and they find tools above it. And they look at the tools, and they find that the people who made the ones above the ash were making them in essentially the same way as the people who made the ones below it. And they sit with that for a moment in the dry Andhra Pradesh heat, and they understand that they are looking at something that does not fit the story. But the story does not dissolve easily. It never does when it has been sitting in the textbooks for a decade and repeated in documentary after documentary and cited in hundreds of papers as context for unrelated claims. The story has momentum. The question that immediately arises around the Jwalapuram evidence is not simply whether people were there. The question is who those people were. This is where the argument gets more complicated and more interesting, and where the certainty that the catastrophe hypothesis required on all sides begins to show its actual texture, which is something much rougher than certainty, because the identity of the toolmakers at Jwalapuram is genuinely contested. Some researchers read the Middle Stone Age character of those assemblages as evidence that modern humans, fully modern Homo sapiens, were already present in India before 74,000 years ago, which is itself a revision of the standard out-of-Africa timeline, which placed the major dispersal of modern humans out of Africa after 60,000 years ago. If Petraglia's reading is correct or close to correct, then our species was spread more widely across the world earlier than the consensus supposed, which makes the idea that Toba wiped out a globally significant fraction of us even harder to sustain. Other researchers push back on this. They argue that similar-looking tools could have been made by archaic populations, by earlier migrants, by people who are not quite Homo sapiens in the way we use that term today, or by Homo sapiens so early in their dispersal that the question of who counts as modern is itself blurry at the edges. The stone tools alone, however carefully described and photographed and measured, cannot tell us with certainty which species left them. Bones would tell us more. Bones that could be dated and measured and compared to known populations would anchor the identification more firmly. Bones at Jwalapuram are largely absent. The acidic soil conditions of the Indian subcontinent are not kind to skeletal material, and the record is sparse, so the identity question stays open, a parked unknown that the evidence cannot yet close, and it is important to hold it open rather than pretend it is resolved in either direction. What the tool identity does not change, however, is the structural problem the continuity across the ash creates for the catastrophe hypothesis. Whether those tools were made by fully modern humans or by somewhat earlier or slightly different populations of our broad lineage, the fact that the same tool-making tradition runs continuously through the ash layer means that the population in the Jureru River Valley, whoever they were, was not extinguished by the eruption. They were not even apparently disrupted enough for their stoneworking practice to shift. They kept doing what they had been doing. The winter, if there was one, did not end them here. And that is the word that begins to accumulate weight as you move through the evidence here. Not everywhere. Not necessarily on the whole Indian subcontinent, not with certainty across all of South Asia, but here, in this valley, in this sediment sequence, these tools. Here, the continuity is visible and measurable and recorded in the published scientific literature. What happens when you look somewhere else? Move now from the dry river valleys of Andhra Pradesh to something entirely different, to the floor of a deep African lake, 1,200 kilometers of water and geology away from the Indian Ocean coast, in a place that should have registered the winter if the winter happened. Lake Malawi is one of the great rift lakes of East Africa, deep and old and remarkably good at recording what happens at its surface and in its watershed. It has been accumulating sediment for millions of years, and that sediment is layered with the same patient precision as the riverbank deposits in India, except that a lake floor is often better preserved and more continuous than a river valley, because rivers flood and cut and rework their own sediment, while a lake bottom simply accumulates year after year, climate signal by climate signal, pollen by pollen, algal bloom by algal bloom. In 2013, a team led by Christopher Lane, Barry Chorn, and Thomas Johnson published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and what they had done was examine a high-resolution sediment core from Lake Malawi, and in that core they had found the Toba ash. Not a lot of it. At this distance from Sumatra, the ash arrives as cryptotephra, which means microscopic shards of volcanic glass, invisible to the naked eye, identifiable only under a microscope and through chemical analysis of their composition. But it is there. Chemically, unambiguously, the fingerprint of the Youngest Toba Tuff is present in the mud of Lake Malawi, which is itself a remarkable thing, a demonstration of how far that eruption reached and how useful it is as a marker horizon for synchronizing records across continents. The ash is there, the volcanic fingerprint is in the mud. The eruption left its signature at this African lake, as it left its signature in the Arabian Sea in the Bay of Bengal, in the South China Sea, in river valleys across India. The event is recorded. The clock ticked, and Lake Malawi's sediment noted it the way it notes everything, one thin layer at a time. But here is what Lane and Chorn and Johnson found when they looked at the biological and chemical proxies surrounding that ash layer. The algae, the pollen, the indicators of vegetation in the watershed, the signals that together paint a picture of what the local climate and ecosystem were doing at the time of the eruption. They found nothing, or rather, they found no significant change. The vegetation proxies do not shift dramatically at the level of the ash. The algal assemblages do not show the kind of sudden disruption you would expect from a multi-year collapse of sunlight and growing season. The ecosystem around Lake Malawi, as recorded in this sediment core, seems to have passed through the Toba event without registering a catastrophe of the kind the volcanic winter hypothesis predicts. This is a striking finding, and it deserves to be held with the same care as the Jwalapuram tools. The ash is there. The winter is not, at least not a winter severe enough or long enough to leave a clear signature in the biological record of this lake, which is precisely the kind of high-resolution archive that should have preserved such a signal if it existed. A multi-year collapse of growing season across Africa, the kind of winter that Ambrose's model required, 6 years of reduced sunlight and crop failure and temperature suppression, should appear in the pollen and the algae the way a fist appears in clay. It should be unmistakable. It should be the clearest thing in the record, a sudden step change in the ecosystem proxies that anyone reading the core could see at once. It is not there. What is there is the volcanic glass, patient and precise, the chemical signature of a moment 74,000 years ago when something 3,000 miles away in Sumatra blew so hard that its fingerprint reached this lake. And beside it, in the same sediment, the quiet continuation of an ecosystem going about its ordinary rhythms of drought and flood and seasonal change, as though nothing unusual had interrupted them. Now, move the scene again. Go south, down the coast of Africa, around the Cape, to a place where the continent juts into the cold meeting of two oceans, and the cliffs have been eroding for long enough that the layers inside them are exposed like the pages of an open book. Pinnacle Point is on the southern coast of South Africa, near the town of Mossel Bay, and it has been the site of ongoing archaeological excavation for many years. The caves there are famous, or they are famous among people who think carefully about the deep history of our species, because they sit in a landscape where the changing sea levels of the ice ages repeatedly exposed and submerged a broad, flat shelf of coastal habitat, and the people who lived there tens of thousands of years ago had access to shellfish and to ochre and to fine-grained silcrete stone, and they were doing things with these materials that look, to modern eyes, like sophisticated, flexible, behaviorally modern behavior. In 2018, a team led by Benjamin Smith and including other researchers published work in the journal Nature identifying Toba cryptotephra, those same microscopic glass shards chemically matched to the Youngest Toba Tuff, at Pinnacle Point sites. And what they found surrounding those glass shards was not a break in the human occupation, not a thinning or a disappearance of the archaeological signal, but rather what they described as continuation and, in some respects, flourishing. The coastal populations at Pinnacle Point did not disappear during the window of the Toba eruption. They were there before it and there after it, and the record of their presence does not show the kind of disruption that a volcanic winter severe enough to crash the global human population would be expected to produce. This is 3 independent lines of evidence now from 3 very different settings: a river valley in India, a lake floor in East Africa, a coastal cave system in South Africa. And they are telling versions of the same story. The ash arrives, and then the record continues. Whatever happened in the centuries around 74,000 years ago, in these places, at these sites, It does not look like a species-ending winter. It looks like people and ecosystems getting on with things. And the proper scientific response to that is not to declare the matter closed in favor of the reversal, not to say the catastrophe hypothesis is definitively wrong and humanity sailed through Toba without difficulty. The proper scientific response is to say the evidence that would most clearly confirm the catastrophe is not appearing in the places where it should appear most clearly. And that is a serious problem for the hypothesis. Not a fatal wound, necessarily, but a serious problem, because hypotheses are not entitled to the absence of evidence in their favor. A well-supported hypothesis predicts things, and those predictions should be findable in the world. The volcanic winter hypothesis predicts that the Toba ash should be surrounded by signals of ecological and demographic collapse in the record, wherever that record is good enough to show it. It predicts gaps in human occupation above the ash. It predicts disrupted vegetation proxies in the lake cores. It predicts a silence in the coastal caves, and the record in the places where researchers have looked carefully is not showing those predicted silences. The record is showing, with some variation and some uncertainty, something that looks more like continuation. Now there is a version of the catastrophe hypothesis that can respond to this. It is a more modest, more regional version than the one that appeared in the textbooks. It can say, perhaps the most severe effects were concentrated in a particular zone, closest to the eruption, downwind of it, in the places that received the thickest ashfall. Perhaps Peninsular India bears the brunt, and perhaps in some parts of Peninsular India the human population did collapse, and the Jwalapuram evidence represents survivors or a refuge population that came through, but does not represent the whole picture. Perhaps Lake Malawi and Pinnacle Point are simply far enough from the epicenter that the winter they experienced was mild enough to leave no clear biological signature. Perhaps the catastrophe was real but geographically patchy, devastating in some places and merely unpleasant in others. This is a coherent argument. It cannot be dismissed easily. The geography of a volcanic winter is not uniform. The sulfate aerosols spread through the stratosphere in ways that are sensitive to the season of the eruption, the wind patterns of the year, the latitude and longitude of different regions. A different part of the world from Pinnacle Point might have experienced a harsher several years. The absence of a catastrophic signal in East Africa and South Africa and the Jureru River Valley does not prove that the catastrophe happened nowhere. It proves that the catastrophe, if it happened, did not happen uniformly and did not happen severely enough in these particular places to leave the clear record the original hypothesis seemed to require. But this is already a significant retreat from the version of the story that entered the textbooks. The original claim was global, or near-global. The original claim was that humanity as a whole, the entire species, wherever it was dispersed across the world, it was items crashed to a few thousand individuals. That is not a regional story. That is not a story about a particularly bad volcanic winter in central India while things were fine on the African coast. That is a story about the near-total collapse of a species, leaving a handful of survivors from whom all living humans descend, and the genetic signal of that near collapse is written into the DNA of every person alive today. If the catastrophe was regional and patchy, that story does not hold in the form it was told. It might hold in a weaker form, a significant setback in some populations, a contribution to the low genetic diversity we observe, one factor among several. But the clean narrative of near-extinction and bottleneck and descent from a tiny surviving group, the narrative that made the hypothesis famous and got it into the popular press and into the documentaries and into the curriculum, that narrative requires a global catastrophe, and the record, as it accumulates, is looking less and less like a global catastrophe. It is looking instead like a very large eruption, a genuinely enormous, genuinely the largest in 2 million years, that happened at a particular moment in the history of a species that was apparently already more widely spread and more resilient than the hypothesis supposed. And the winter that followed, however severe in the stratospheric models, did not translate into the ground-level catastrophe that the story required. Turn now to the climate models themselves, because this is where another prop under the hypothesis was quietly removed, not by archaeologists or geneticists, but by climate scientists running the numbers again with better tools. The original winter scenario, with the 6-year freeze with a 1,000-year cold snap, the world plunged into darkness as the sulfate aerosols blocked the sun, was modelled, not measured. There was no one alive 74,000 years ago to record the temperature, and the proxies in the ice cores and the sediments, however informative, have limited resolution at this timescale. The volcanic winter was always an inference from the physics of eruptions and from comparison with smaller documented events. The comparison that made it plausible was Tambora. The Mount Tambora eruption of 1815, also in Indonesia, also on the island of Sumbawa, just a few hundred kilometers from where we are now in the archipelago, was a VEI 7 event, one step below VEI 8 on a logarithmic scale, which means roughly 10 times smaller in erupted volume than Toba. Tambora killed tens of thousands of people directly and sent enough sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to cause the year without a summer in 1816. There was snow in June in New England, there were crop failures across Europe, there was famine in parts of Asia. Livestock died. The poet Lord Byron wrote a poem called Darkness. The artist, J.M.W. Turner, may have been painting the blood-orange skies that the aerosols produced. It was a real and documented catastrophe, and it came from an eruption that was, by geological standards, far smaller than Toba. So if Tambora did that, what did Toba do? This is the logic that made the volcanic winter hypothesis compelling, and it is not wrong logic. The scaling argument is reasonable. An eruption roughly 100 times larger than Tambora in erupted volume should, all else being equal, produce effects much larger than those of Tambora. And Tambora's effects were severe enough to kill crops in the northern hemisphere. Scaling up from there leads to something that looks like an ice age in fast-forward years or decades of reduced sunlight and failed harvests and plummeting temperatures, and the appeal of that scenario to explain a genetic bottleneck is obvious. But the scaling does not work simply, and this is what the later climate models began to reveal. The sulfur dioxide that causes the cooling is not perfectly proportional to the volume of magma erupted. The magma's sulfur content matters. The altitude the eruption reaches into the stratosphere matters. The season of the year and the latitude matter because they affect how the aerosols spread across hemispheres. And, crucially, the aerosols saturate at some point. Beyond a certain concentration in the stratosphere, adding more sulfur does not linearly increase the cooling because the aerosols are already blocking most of the relevant wavelengths of sunlight, and the additional sulfur is doing diminishing work. There is, in the climate physics, something like a point of diminishing returns for catastrophe, past which a larger eruption does not produce proportionally worse cooling. Different modeling groups using different climate models with different assumptions about the sulfur yield of the Toba magma and the atmospheric dynamics of 74,000 years ago have gotten different answers. Some models reproduce something approaching the multi-year catastrophic winter that Ambrose's original hypothesis assumed. Others produce regional cooling of a few degrees sustained for a few years. Severe, certainly. Bad for agriculture if humans had been farming, hard on populations that depended on vegetation. But not the planetary freeze that the near-extinction story required. The models are sensitive to their assumptions in ways that make it genuinely difficult to pin down what actually happened without better proxy evidence than we currently have. And this is a second sense in which the hypothesis has been weakened without being closed. The climate physics says a severe winter was possible, maybe likely. It does not say the specific severity that the catastrophe narrative assumed was inevitable or even the most probable outcome. The narrative settled on a worst-case model and treated it as the established fact, and the subsequent modeling has expanded the range of possibilities back toward a messier, less dramatic, more contested middle ground. What does all of this leave us with? 3 lines of archaeological evidence, Jwalapuram, Lake Malawi, Pinnacle Point, that show continuation rather than collapse in the places that should most clearly show collapse if the hypothesis is correct. A set of climate models that in their range include catastrophe but do not require it, and in some runs produce something considerably milder, and a hypothesis that was assembled from a genetic observation and a worst-case climate model in 1998, circulated in the scientific literature, simplified in the translation to popular science and documentary film, and arrived in millions of households as a settled fact about how close humanity came to extinction. The tools in the Jureru River Valley were not waiting to embarrass the hypothesis. They were just there, as they had been for 74,000 years in the sediment, patient as the sediment always is. The pollen and algae in Lake Malawi's cores were not lying in wait. They were simply recording what the climate around that lake was actually doing year by year, in the way that lake sediments do, preserving the signal honestly, whether anyone was going to look at it or not. The glass shards at Pinnacle Point were not placed there to complicate a story. They arrived on the wind from an eruption on the other side of the Indian Ocean and fell into the coastal sediment and stayed there, carrying their chemical fingerprint, until researchers came along with the right analytical tools to find them and read them. The evidence was in the ground. It has been there since the eruption. It only needed to be found. And when it was found, it did not say what the hypothesis needed it to say. This is not a story about scientists getting it wrong and then getting it right. It is a story about how a hypothesis that was constructed carefully from real evidence using real reasoning can harden into orthodoxy before the full weight of evidence is in. Because the full weight of evidence takes decades to accumulate, and the hypothesis is appealing and the explanatory framework is compelling, and the genetic observation it was built on is genuine. Low human genetic diversity is a real thing. The out of Africa moment was real. The eruption was real, enormously, geologically, spectacularly real. The tools for collecting and analyzing the kind of evidence that would confirm or complicate the hypothesis did not all exist in 1998, and even the tools that existed required time and fieldwork and funding and collaboration to deploy. Science moves slowly in the world. The Jureru River Valley was not excavated with the right questions in mind until Petraglia's team brought those questions to it. The Lake Malawi core was not analyzed with the ash layer as a focal point until Lane and Chorn and Johnson brought their attention to it. The Pinnacle Point cryptotephra was not identified until the appropriate analytical chemistry was applied. Each of these findings took years of work to produce and years of review and follow-up to absorb. And in the meantime, the hypothesis circulated as fact, because that is how knowledge moves through culture, slowly in its revision, quickly in its adoption, and with a great deal of friction in the space between what the specialists are arguing about and what the textbooks and the documentaries have already set down as established. The question that still waits in the present tense is not whether the Toba catastrophe hypothesis is wrong. It is whether it is wrong enough to retire, or whether a modified version of it, or a regional, patchy, more modest version, a setback rather than a near extinction, can be sustained by the evidence that does exist. And that question is genuinely open. Researchers are still working on it. The sediment cores from new sites are still being analysed. The stone tools in other parts of India and Southeast Asia are still being excavated and described and dated. The climate modelers are still refining their estimates of Toba's sulfur yield and the atmospheric dynamics of 74,000 years ago. What we have right now is a hypothesis that entered the textbooks in its most dramatic form and is leaving them very slowly, unevenly, without a clean announcement, in a more uncertain and provisional form. What we have is the knowledge that the tools kept being made, that the lake recorded no winter, that the coastal people kept living, and we still do not know exactly why we are all so remarkably similar to one another genetically, why any two humans are more alike than two chimpanzees from the same forest, why the genetic diversity of our species is so low given how long we have been walking the Earth. That question was what the Toba hypothesis answered so elegantly in 1998, and answering it in a different way requires a different kind of patience, the kind that stays open to the evidence wherever it leads. The genetics themselves have been quietly turning away from the volcano too, and that is where this story goes next. And the turning away has been gradual, not a single announcement, not a paper that swept the older model off the table in one decisive motion, but a slow and cumulative reorientation, the kind that happens in science when the instruments get sharper and the questions get harder, and the initial answer, however satisfying it once seemed, stops fitting the contours of the new data. To understand what the genetics are now saying, and what they are not saying, you have to go back to what the genetics were originally doing when they first raised the alarm. The observation that Henry Harpending and his colleagues made in 1993 was real, and it remains real. Human mitochondrial DNA shows a strikingly low level of diversity. You could take two people from opposite ends of the Earth, two people whose ancestors have not encountered one another in tens of thousands of years, and their genetic material would be more similar to one another than two chimpanzees living in the same forest would be to each other. That is not a marginal or statistical curiosity. That is a pronounced, measurable, repeatedly confirmed feature of our species, and it demands an explanation. The low diversity is the bedrock. Everything that was built on top of it, the story of the near-extinction, the volcanic winter, the shrunken remnant of a species, was an attempt to explain that bedrock. Stanley Ambrose in 1998 offered the most dramatically compelling explanation available at the time: a catastrophic bottleneck, a sudden compression of the population to a few thousand individuals, separated perhaps by geography and luck from the worst of the ash and the cold, who then expanded again when the climate relented. A compression followed by an expansion would produce exactly the kind of low-diversity genetic signature Harpending's team had found. The dates seemed to line up. The mechanism, the volcanic winter, was plausible even if the evidence for its severity came from models rather than observation. The ash was everywhere. The hypothesis was elegant. It hardened quickly into something that felt like fact. But the tools that coalescent dating uses, the statistical methods for working backwards from the diversity we observe today to the population history that produced it, have been substantially refined in the years since 1998. Coalescent analysis at its simplest works something like this. If you know approximately how fast genetic mutations accumulate over generations, and you can measure how different from one another the versions of a gene are in a modern population, you can estimate roughly how long ago all those versions shared a common ancestor, and from that you can infer something about the size of the population at that time. A very small population, like a bottleneck, will leave a genetic signature in which many lineages share a common ancestor that is relatively recent, because in a small population, the chances of inheriting genetic material from the same individual a few generations back are much higher. It is a probabilistic inference, not a direct observation, and the answers it gives depend heavily on the assumptions built into the model. What the improved methods have shown as whole genome data became available rather than just mitochondrial DNA sequences is that the story is considerably more complicated than the early coalescent work suggested. The newer analyses do not produce a single clean, sharp crash at 74,000 years ago. They produce a range of possible population histories, and many of them are consistent with the low diversity we observe today without requiring a catastrophic single event at precisely the moment Toba erupted. One of the competing explanations is, in its way, almost more unsettling than the volcanic catastrophe. It is the possibility that for most of the time we have existed as a species, not just for a few years or a few centuries following a disaster, but for tens of thousands of years, perhaps longer, our total population was simply small, persistently, chronically small. Not because of one sudden hammer blow from the sky, but because the world was hard, because Africa was vast, and the people were few and scattered across it, because disease and drought and the ordinary cruelty of the Pleistocene kept the numbers down generation after generation. A long, gradual, small population produces the same kind of low-diversity signature as a short, severe bottleneck. The genetic record cannot always distinguish between them. The compressive narrative, the moment of near extinction, is one reading of the data. The prolonged thinness of our early presence on Earth is another. And then there is the out-of-Africa founder effect, which offers a third explanation that requires no catastrophe at all, and no exceptional smallness of the ancestral African population either. When a subset of a population leaves and establishes itself in a new place, it carries with it only a portion of the genetic diversity of the original group. Each successive migration out of Africa and into the Middle East, from there into Europe and Asia, from there into the islands and the Americas, involves a further sampling, a further narrowing of the diversity that was present in the group before. The modern human populations outside Africa, taken together, are less genetically diverse than the populations within Africa, a fact consistent with the idea that the out-of-Africa event, whenever it occurred, and in whatever numbers, involved a relatively small founding group. The low diversity we observe globally is partly the shadow of that departure, that small band who walked north and east, and gradually became everyone who now lives outside the continent where our species began. No volcano required, no crash of any particular severity, just the arithmetic of small founders multiplied by time. None of these alternatives is a clean answer. Each of them carries its own uncertainties. The question of what exactly happened to the size of the human population over the last 100,000 years, and why our genetic diversity is so low compared to what you might expect from a species our age, is not a closed question. It was not closed by Ambrose in 1998, and it is not closed now. What has changed is that the Toba catastrophe is no longer the default answer, the thing everyone points to because it seems to fit. It has become one candidate among several, and a somewhat battered candidate at that, requiring the volcanic winter to have been severe enough and the population to have been vulnerable enough and the timing to have been precise enough for the story to hold together. And the evidence for all three of those conditions is weaker than it looked 25 years ago. There is also a detail worth clarifying, because the scientific literature has become tangled enough in recent years that even careful readers sometimes conflate two quite different claims about ancient human genetics. In 2023, a genetic study led by Hugh and colleagues published in Science proposed a different and older bottleneck in human evolutionary history. A compression that occurred not 74,000 years ago but approximately 900,000 years ago, deep in the Pleistocene, before the emergence of our own species as we recognize it. That study suggested a prolonged period of very small population size stretching over perhaps 100,000 years, around the time of a major transition in the pattern of ice ages. The proposal attracted significant attention and significant skepticism. Other researchers questioned the methods and the conclusions, and the claim remains contested. But the critical point here is that it has nothing to do with Toba. Nothing to do with the supereruption, nothing to do with the bottleneck hypothesis that Ambrose assembled, nothing to do with the ash that is still sitting in the sediment layers of rivers across southern Asia. The 900,000-year-ago bottleneck, if it happened, is a completely separate event on a completely separate timescale, addressing a completely different moment in our evolutionary past. The two claims should not be woven together. Mentioning this not to add confusion but to remove it, because the drift between these different stories, a volcanic catastrophe at 74,000 years, an ancient evolutionary compression nearly 1 million years ago, the natural low diversity that follows any founding population, is part of how the popular understanding of human origins becomes harder and harder to navigate. The precision of the date, the precision of the cause, matters. 74,000 years ago was Toba. 900,000 years ago was something else entirely, and whether it happened at all is still, as of now, an open argument among geneticists. So here is the honest verdict, stated as plainly as the evidence permits. The Toba catastrophe hypothesis, in the form that it circulated through textbooks and documentaries and popular articles for the better part of 2 decades, the volcanic winter that lasted years, the population that crashed to a few thousand individuals, the near-extinction that explains why we are all so genetically alike, that version of the story has been weakened, not destroyed, not cleanly falsified, but weakened from multiple directions simultaneously by people working independently on different kinds of evidence in different parts of the world. The stone tools at Jwalapuram that continued without interruption across the ash. The lake sediments at Malawi that recorded no catastrophic winter. The coastal settlements at Pinnacle Point that showed people living and apparently thriving through the eruption window. The climate models that produced milder and more regional effects than the original worst-case scenario. The genetic analyses that stopped pointing cleanly at a sharp crash at exactly 74,000 years ago. Each of those threads, pulled independently, loosens the knot. Pulled together, they loosen it considerably. But loosened is not the same as undone. The hypothesis is not debunked in the way that a calculation is shown to be wrong. One clear error, game over. It is disputed, which is a different thing, and in some ways a more intellectually uncomfortable thing, because dispute does not give you a clean answer to carry away. It is possible still that Toba caused a real and severe disruption, perhaps not a global extinction-level winter, perhaps not a near-total crash of the population, but a regional catastrophe that was brutal for the people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, that wiped out populations in parts of Southeast Asia, that set back the expansion of our species in certain corridors by thousands of years. A kinder, smaller, patchier version of the catastrophe is still on the table. The evidence does not rule it out. It rules out the grandest claims, the extinction-scale drama, the 1,000 breeding pairs huddled in some genetic Eden while the sky fell. But a genuine setback, a regional crisis, a long, cold, hard season in the history of our kind that remains possible. And that is not a weak conclusion, that is the appropriate conclusion given what the evidence actually shows. The distinction between a near-extinction and a setback is not a minor revision of the story. It is the difference between a species on the edge of oblivion and a species that faced a hard time and came through it, which is what the stone tools at Jwalapuram are quietly suggesting every time a researcher looks at them. Those tools did not know they were supposed to stop. The people making them did not know they were participants in a near extinction. They made their tools and they lived their lives, and the ash came down and the air was probably cold and the light was probably strange and thin, and they kept going. That is not nothing. That is, in a certain light, everything. What this story is really about, the deeper thing it is asking, is not the size of a volcanic eruption or the chemistry of stratospheric aerosols, or even the statistical methods used to date the coalescent ancestors of mitochondrial lineages. It is about something that happens in science with a regularity that should perhaps make us more humble than it usually does, which is the conversion of a hypothesis into a fact. It is about how a model gets told as a memory. Think about what Ambrose had in 1998. He had a genetic observation, low diversity, that was real and needed explaining. He had a date for a catastrophic eruption that appeared to line up with the genetic signal. He had a physical mechanisms, the volcanic winter, that was plausible based on the behavior of smaller eruptions like Tambora. He had a simple, coherent, memorable story that tied all of these things together. That story was compelling not because it was proven, but because it was elegant. It explained a puzzling observation by connecting it to a dramatic event, and it did so in a way that was consistent with the evidence then available. That is what a good scientific hypothesis does. That is what it is supposed to do. But somewhere in the subsequent years, as the story spread from the journal where it was published to the textbooks, from the textbooks to the documentaries, from the documentaries to the articles and the podcasts and the popular summaries, something happened to its epistemic status. The hedge marks fell off. The hypothesis became a discovery. The suggests became shows. The model output, the few thousand survivors, the 1,000 breeding pairs, teens, got detached from the footnote that explained it was a model output and started circulating as a number, as a head count, as though someone had been there to count. And the story became, in the public understanding, something that had happened, something that was known, a fact of prehistory, as firm as the date of a battle or the name of a king. This is not a failure unique to Toba. It is a pattern that appears whenever science produces a striking narrative and the machinery of popular communication takes it up. The narrative simplifies as narratives must, because the full texture of the uncertainty, the range of estimates, the model dependencies, the ongoing debate, the provisional nature of the dating, cannot survive intact through every retelling. And once the narrative is simple enough and vivid enough and dramatic enough, it begins to carry itself, to replicate through the information environment, not because it is verified at every step, but because it is a good story, the volcano that almost ended us, the last few thousand survivors, the genetic narrowness that marks us all as children of that same crisis. It has everything a story needs: a catastrophe, a near miss, a survival, a trace that is still visible in our own bodies. Of course it's spread, of course it's stuck, but the evidence does not care about the story. The evidence is what gets dug out of riverbeds in Andhra Pradesh and what gets pulled from the sediment at the bottom of an East African lake, and what emerges from the sequencing of whole human genomes as the technology to do it becomes sharper and cheaper and more widely available. And the evidence has been speaking for the last 15 years or so in a voice that is quiet and incremental and not well suited to headlines, saying something like, "This is more complicated than you thought." The people in India kept making their tools. The lake in Africa recorded no catastrophe. The coast of South Africa was inhabited through the window. The genetics no longer point cleanly at the volcano. The picture is changing. It is not fully changed, but it is changing. There is something worth sitting with in that, particularly at this hour of the night, when the mind is moving towards sleep and the ordinary vigilance of the day is softening. The idea that something can be so firmly lodged in the common understanding, repeated in classrooms and documentaries and casual conversations, stated as a known fact about where we all come from, and yet be, at the level of the actual evidence, an unsettled and provisional claim that a dispersed community of researchers is still actively contesting. Not because of fraud or error or ideology, but simply because the original synthesis was made with the best tools available at the time, and the tools have improved, and the improved tools have produced a more complicated answer. We are more comfortable with science as a collection of conclusions than as a process of perpetual revision. And the Toba story is, in the end, a lesson in the process. The conclusion, nearly went extinct, barely survived, was what travelled. The process, a hypothesis assembled in 1998 from a genetic observation and a climate model and a volcanic date, then progressively undone by stone tools and lake cores and coastline settlements and refined genetics, is what is actually happening in real time in the pages of journals and the proceedings of conferences and the fieldwork seasons of people who are spending their careers in dry riverbeds in southern India and on the shores of East African lakes because they believe the evidence is not finished telling them something. What the tools at Jwalapuram are saying, if you are willing to read them, is this: we were here before the ash came down. We were here after. We did not know enough about what had happened to mourn it as a catastrophe. We only knew how to make the thing that had kept us alive, and so we made it. The Middle Stone Age nappers in that river valley, whoever they were, modern humans already deep into their southward and eastward expansion, or a population of archaic people whose descendants we may or may not carry in our own genomes, that question remaining open, kept working. The hand pressed the flint. The flint split along the grain. The blade was sharper than before. The ash settled in the air around them, and then it settled on the ground, and time kept moving in the only direction it has ever moved. The lake in Malawi was not disrupted. The algae grew and died in their ordinary cycles through the years that the ash was falling and the years just after. The light may have been strange for a season. The temperatures may have dipped for months or years in ways that made the growing season shorter and the hunger deeper in some places. But the lake kept its record in the mud at its bottom, layer by layer, year by year, and the record does not show a catastrophe. It shows a disturbance in the signal and then the signal resuming. And on the coast of South Africa, at Pinnacle Point, where the tiny glass shards of the Youngest Toba Tuff have been found in the coastal sediment, people were living by the sea as they had before and continued to do after. The ocean did not stop providing. The shellfish did not stop being available. The ochre the people used to mark themselves, with what meaning we cannot now know, was still being ground and applied. The occupation continued. The evidence for flourishing through the eruption window is not emphatic, but it is there, and it will not go away simply because the old story was more dramatic. All of this is why the question the title asks, the extinction that maybe never happened, carries its weight. It does not answer itself. It sits in the honest territory between it happened and nearly ended us, and it was always a myth. The territory between those poles is where the actual science lives, and it is less comfortable than either pole, but it is also more true to what the evidence shows. The catastrophe version is weakened. The alternative versions, the persistent small population, the founder effect, the regional setback, rather than the global near-extinction, are not yet proven either. We are in the middle of the argument. The researchers are still working. The sediment cores from new sites are still being processed, the genomes are still being sequenced, and the coalescent models are still being refined. The story is not over. It may not be over in our lifetimes. And perhaps that is what it means that a model became a memory. When the model was first assembled in 1998, it was presented as a hypothesis, a way of accounting for the evidence then available. But the memory is more durable than the model. The memory travels through a culture and embeds itself and becomes part of what people feel they know about where they come from, about the precariousness of human survival, about the closeness of oblivion in our species' past. And when the model is revised, when the tools keep being made across the ash, when the lake records no winter, when the genetics stop pointing cleanly at the date, the memory does not revise at the same pace. The memory keeps circulating, keeps being repeated, keeps feeling true because it felt true when it first arrived, and because nothing has delivered a clean, simple replacement for it. That gap between the model that has softened and the memory that has not is where we live right now as a culture, trying to understand where we came from. The textbooks are being updated slowly and unevenly. The popular accounts are still mostly telling the old story. The researchers who have spent their careers on the evidence are living in a more uncertain and provisional world than the one the documentaries describe. That gap will close eventually. New evidence will either rehabilitate a modified version of the catastrophe or confirm that the extinction never quite happened the way the story said. But it has not closed yet, and in the meantime, the honest thing, the thing the evidence actually supports, is to hold the uncertainty and to say that this is contested, that the arguments are ongoing, and that the tools kept being made. The hand that knapped the flint beside the Jureru River in a dry valley in what is now the state of Andhra Pradesh 74,000 years ago or thereabouts left its evidence in the stone, not in the genome, or not unambiguously, not in the climate record, which does not distinguish who was making fire and who was not. In the stone, in the shape of the blade, in the particular angle at which a core was struck to produce the tool that was needed that day, that evidence is still there. It waited in the sediment for 74,000 years, and then Michael Petraglia's team reached the right layer in the right valley and found it, and found above it, separated only by the thin, pale line of the Youngest Toba Tuff, more tools made in the same way. What the catastrophe hypothesis asked us to imagine was an absence, a gap, a silence in the record where the human presence flickered out and then, after the long cold, ignited again from the few who remained. But in the Jureru River Valley, that silence is not there. The record does not show a gap. It shows a continuation, and a continuation across the event that was supposed to produce the deepest gap in human prehistory is a remarkable thing to find. It does not prove there was no catastrophe anywhere. It does not prove the worldwide population kept its numbers or that no one died in the ash and the cold. People may have died in great numbers in the places where the ash was thickest and the winter was sharpest. The catastrophe hypothesis was never really about whether people died. People always die in every century of every imaginable difficulty, but about whether the species as a whole came close to not surviving. And the tools in the Jureru Valley are evidence, quiet and precise and 74,000 years old, that at least in this one place, in this one river valley, under this one sky that had gone grey with ash, a human being picked up a stone and made a tool. And that is the opposite of extinction. Let the deep thoughts settle and let yourself sink with them. And then the genetics began to move. For a long time, the genetic evidence felt like the firm ground under the whole structure. The low diversity of human DNA, the plain, measurable fact that any two people alive today are remarkably similar at the level of their genomes, far more similar than two chimpanzees from the same forest, seemed to demand an explanation. And the Toba eruption, with its date and its scale and its plausible mechanism, seemed to provide one. The reasoning was clean. The volcano happened, the winter followed. The population crashed, and the crash left its scar in the DNA of every person who descended from the few who survived. It was a story that connected a geological event to a genetic signal, and for roughly 2 decades, that connection felt solid. But the coalescent models were never as precise as they were sometimes presented. A coalescent analysis works backward from patterns of genetic variation in living populations, constructing an estimate of how large a founding population must have been and approximately when it lived. The estimate is sensitive to the assumptions you feed it, mutation rates, generation times, migration models, which part of the genome you are analyzing. When those assumptions changed, as they did repeatedly over the 15 years following the hypothesis's crystallization, the resulting dates changed with them. What had appeared to be a sharp crash conveniently near 74,000 years ago began to soften into something less specific. The whole genome data that became available in later years, far richer than the mitochondrial DNA that Henry Harpending and colleagues were working from in 1993, produced population histories that were more complex, more gradual, and less willing to point at a single moment as the catastrophe. The diversity is still low. That has not changed and will not change, because it is simply a property of the genome that can be measured. But low diversity has more than one explanation, and Toba is only one of them. A species that has been small for a long time. Not catastrophically small, not teetering on extinction, but persistently and gradually small across hundreds of thousands of years, will also show reduced diversity. The mathematics of population genetics does not require a single dramatic crash. It requires smallness sustained over enough generations for diversity to erode, and the ancestors of every living human being were, by the standards of large mammals, a modest and thinly spread species for a very long time before they became numerous. The out-of-Africa expansion itself, whenever and however it happened, would have carried only a fraction of the diversity present in Africa through a geographic founder effect, a bottleneck not of catastrophe but of migration, of the subset of people who happened to be the ones who moved. These explanations do not need a volcano. They need time and smallness, and the ordinary mathematics of a species that was never, until quite recently, particularly abundant. This is why the Toba hypothesis, in its strong form, has weakened without being refuted outright. The evidence against it is not a single knockout. It is the slow accumulation of evidence that declines to confirm it. The African lake that shows no winter, the South African coastal people who flourished, the Indian Valley where the tools continued, and now the genetics that no longer point cleanly at 74,000 years as the moment of the great narrowing. Each piece of evidence taken alone might be explained away. Together they have shifted the weight of the argument, and the hypothesis now requires more special pleading than it once did. There is one thing worth clarifying, because the field of ancient human genetics has become busy and occasionally confusing, and the Toba bottleneck is not the only bottleneck in the conversation. In 2023, a team of researchers, including Haipeng Li, published a paper in Science proposing a severe and separate population bottleneck far older than Toba, somewhere around 900,000 years ago, in which the ancestral human lineage may have been reduced to perhaps a few thousand individuals over an extended period. This is a genuinely distinct and independently disputed claim. It concerns a different time, a different set of genetic signatures, and a different proposed cause. It has nothing to do with the Toba eruption and should not be folded into the same argument. The debates are running in parallel, not in sequence, and conflating them would misrepresent both. The Hu et al. Finding from 2023 is contested on its own terms and remains an open question on its own terms. The Toba question is a separate open question. The history of our species, it seems, is a series of open questions stacked inside one another, and the honest answer to most of them is that the scientists are still working. So here is the honest verdict, stated plainly because it is the only verdict the evidence supports. The Toba catastrophe hypothesis is not debunked. It is not closed. It has not been replaced by a new consensus that says nothing happened and no one suffered, and the eruption was merely a geological footnote. What has happened over 15 years of accumulating evidence from Indian river valleys and African lake cores and coastal caves and improving genomic analysis is that the hypothesis has been significantly weakened. The three strongest supports under it, the precision of the genetic date, the severity of the volcanic winter, and the apparent gap in the archaeological record, have each been independently complicated. None of the three is as clean as it once appeared, and together they have eroded the confidence with which the claim could be made. The catastrophe version is still possible. A genuinely terrible volcanic winter may have occurred in some regions. Populations may have crashed in areas where the ash was densest and the cold was sharpest. The species may have passed through a difficult interval even if it did not come within a breath of non-existence. The honest position is not certainty in either direction. It is the acknowledgement that a model, a compelling, internally consistent, scientifically serious model, was dressed over time in the language of established fact and is now being carefully undressed. That is how science sometimes works, and it is worth pausing on the shape of the process rather than only its outcome. Stanley Ambrose in 1998 was not speculating recklessly. He was connecting a real geological event to a real genetic signal through a plausible mechanism at a time when the available evidence could support the connection. The hypothesis made predictions and attracted research. Some of that research returned evidence that complicated the story, and some of it returned evidence that made the story stranger than the original model had anticipated. The Jwalapuram excavations were not designed to refute Ambrose. Michael Petraglia's team went to the Jureru River Valley to learn what was there, and what was there turned out to be tools below the ash and tools above it. The Lake Malawi study was not a targeted debunking. It was a sediment record that happened to contain the youngest Toba Tuff and happened to show no corresponding signal of environmental catastrophe at that level. The evidence accumulated not through a campaign, but through the ordinary, patient, unglamorous work of people studying the things they were trained to study. And somewhere at the bottom of all of it, beneath the models and the migration estimates, and the coalescent calculations and the revised climate simulations, there is a layer of ash in a riverbank in Andhra Pradesh. And above it, in the same riverbank, in the same dry valley under the same sky that was once grey with sulphur and the dust of a mountain that had unmade itself, there is a stone tool. It is a specific kind of tool made in a specific way by hands that were almost certainly anatomically modern for purposes we can only infer. It is not a monument, it is not a statement. It was made by someone who needed it and set it down and walked away, and it lay in the sediment for 74,000 years until it was found. The eruption came, the ash fell, the sky changed color, and the rains were disrupted, and the cold descended on some part of the world for some number of years that the models do not yet agree on. And when the ash settled in the Jureru River Valley, someone picked up a stone and kept going. The tools never stopped. That is not a theory. That is the thing they found. What the volcanic winter hypothesis gave us before the evidence began to complicate it was a story about our cell, a story about how narrow the margin was, how close the thread came to breaking, how the entire human experiment hung for years on a few thousand people keeping the fire lit in whatever sheltered place they had found. It was a story that made the present feel fragile and the past feel heroic, and the ordinary fact of existing feel earned. Those feelings are not nothing. The story did real work in the imagination. But the work a story does in the imagination is not the same as the work a hypothesis does in the evidence, and when the evidence stops cooperating, the hypothesis has to follow, regardless of how well the story served us. We are remarkably similar, all of us. That is still true, and the reason for it is still being worked out in genetics laboratories and sediment cores and dry riverbeds by people who are trying to understand not the story we want, but the one that actually happened. The volcano was real, the ash is real, the tools are real. The rest is a question the science has not finished answering. And the most accurate thing that can be said about the extinction that maybe never happened is that the jury is still assembled, and the verdict has not come in, and the evidence keeps arriving. Let the deep thoughts settle and let yourself sink with them.